The world is a big place, and there are many places that are nearly impossible to get to. For the most part, this is even a problem for modern humans, as we have developed some of the greatest transportation technology ever seen. However, even with our advancements, sometimes accidents happen. That is what happened to Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. This plane wasn't going anywhere particularly dangerous. It was simply flying from Uruguay to Chile. But something went terribly wrong, and the plane wound up stranded in one of the most inhospitable places imaginable. To make matters worse, it wasn't just the pilots who were on board, but also an entire rugby team and their families. This meant there were 45 people on board the aircraft, and almost all of them would die. But before we continue, make sure to leave a like and subscribe so you can be notified every time we upload a new video. Also, make sure to stick around until the end to hear about the amazing rescue mission that followed. On October 13th, 1972, Flight 571 took off from Uruguay at 3:15 p.m. The plane was supposed to be arriving in Santiago, Chile by 5:20 p.m., but they were running late. At 5:25, air traffic control tried contacting the pilot of Flight 571, but he didn't respond. Soon after, they lost contact with the plane completely. At first, this wasn't too concerning. Planes go in and out of radio contact all the time. The authorities began sounding the alarm when the plane didn't respond to repeated attempts at contact. Soon enough, the military was sent out to look for the missing plane. As night fell, the military began searching the Andes Mountain. These mountains were jagged and covered in snow, making them very difficult to navigate. Search parties were unable to make much progress. Things weren't looking good for those on board the plane. Meanwhile, those on board were getting more and more desperate. As hours turned into days, it became clear that nobody was coming to save them. The passengers had no choice but to try and make the best of the situation. They did the only thing they could think of. They used emergency rations and what little food the passengers had brought with them to last as long as possible. It would be an understatement to say that the conditions the plane was stranded in were in. Temperatures dropped to negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. This made staying warm a near impossible task. Those who had the warmest clothes were the children. Since they were smaller, they were able to stay warm for longer than the adults. Still, it was clear that they wouldn't be able to survive there forever. Eventually, the Uruguayan government called off the search. This left the 45 people stranded in the Andes Mountains to fend for themselves. Things were bad, but they could still ration their food for a while longer. There was still hope that someone would come looking for them. As the weeks passed, though, it became clear that a rescue mission wasn't coming anytime soon. With no other option, the passengers of Flight 571 had to make the unthinkable decision to turn to cannibalism in order to stay alive. In total, 3 separate groups of passengers were stranded. The first group consisted of 12 people. The second group was made up of 21 people. And the third and final group consisted of 12 people. The biggest group only lasted 10 days without food. During this time, they were forced to drink urine in order to stay hydrated. After 10 days, they decided they had nothing to lose. They began eating the bodies of those who had died. They didn't want to do this, but it was either that or starve to death. Meanwhile, the other 2 groups were doing the same thing. Within a few weeks, the group of 21 people was reduced to 8, and the group of 12 people was reduced to 3. Of the 3 groups, the group of 8 had the best chance of surviving. They had plenty of water and a lot of high-calorie foods, including chocolate, which helped keep their body temperatures up. When the plane first crashed, many of the passengers had been injured. However, the accident hadn't killed them. Unfortunately, these injuries would prove fatal for many of the passengers. With no way to treat their wounds, many of the injuries turned into serious health complications. This is what led to the deaths of many of the passengers. But things weren't looking great for the survivors. Even though they were eating human flesh, the survivors were beginning to weaken. Luckily for them, Two men named Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa were feeling a little better. Nando was only 17 years old when the plane he was on crashed. Roberto was 23. Even though they were both weak from starvation, they felt they were the strongest of the survivors. They wanted to try and find help, so they decided to leave the group. The two young men approached the other survivors and told them about their plan. The other survivors begged them not to go because they might never be seen again. But Nando and Roberto weren't listening. They knew they had to do something drastic if they were ever going to escape the mountain. On December, Nando and Roberto began their journey out of the mountains. The two men had no supplies with them. They weren't even sure if anyone would be willing to help them once they got out. Still, they had no choice but to try. Luckily, Nando and Roberto had some training that would help them on their journey. Nando had been in the Civil Air Patrol, so he knew how to use a map and compass. Roberto, on the other hand, had been in the Boy Scout, so he knew how to build a shelter and start a fire. The two friends planned to travel 10 kilometers each day, then rest and turn back when they reached the 10-kilometer mark. If they did this, they would eventually be able to get out of the mountains. Unfortunately, it was easier said than done. The two men were weak and the weather was freezing cold. Still, they pressed on. After 10 days of walking, the two men came across a lake. The lake was frozen over, but they were able to break the ice and drink some of the water. This gave them the strength to press on. Finally, after 10 days of walking, Nando and Roberto saw some movement in the distance. They couldn't believe their eyes. Was this the rescue they had been hoping for? As they got closer, they realized that what they had seen was actually two dogs. Nando and Roberto waved their arms to get the dogs' attention. The dogs started barking and then ran off. Nando and Roberto looked at each other and broke down crying. Just when they thought all hope was lost, the two men heard some voices. The two men quickly ran over to where they had heard the voices. It was at that moment that they realized they had been found. Nando and Roberto were rescued along with all 16 remaining survivors. Out of the 45 people who had been on board the plane, only 16 survived. The incident became known as the Miracle of the Andes. The survivors were given a hero's welcome when they returned home. Many people questioned how the survivors had managed to survive such a long time without food. The answer was horrifying. The survivors had been eating the bodies of those who had died on the plane. While this is a horrible thing to admit, it's what allowed them to stay alive. After the crash, the question wasn't how long would it take for the survivors to be found, but rather which survivor would betray the others and eat their dead loved ones. The truth was that everyone on board the plane had been forced to resort to cannibalism. In order to stay alive, we may never know how far the human body can go when put to the ultimate test. What we do know is that the survivors of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 managed to push past what they thought was possible. Many of the survivors suffered from survivor's guilt after the crash. This was understandable considering the horrific things they had to do to stay alive. All in all, the crash remains one of the worst disasters in the history of aviation. The crash and subsequent cannibalism remains a taboo subject in Europe. Many of the survivors refuse to talk about the crash, especially the part where they ate the corpses of their loved ones. Hopefully, the story of the survivors will serve as a reminder for all of us to cherish the time we have with our loved ones. Now, check out this video on the Fox TV show That S, based on the true story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, or watch this video instead.